Okay, we are ready to start.
Thank you so much. Good evening and welcome, everyone. Great to see everyone here today. I know last time we met virtually, but it's good to see everyone in person. So we're going to go ahead and get started with the roll call. Supervisor Alcorn. Board Member Karatonis.
Present online.
Supervisor Glass. Councilmember Bagley. Here. Councilmember Duncan.
Here?
And Vice Mayor Pam Celeste, Mrs. Smith.
Yeah. Smith here for her.
Vice Mayor Banks. Councilmember Friedrichs.
Here.
Vice Mayor Martinez. And Councilmember Milan.
Here.
So we do have a quorum. We'll go ahead and get started. The first item on the agenda is the approval of the minutes. At this time, I'll ask for motions to approve the minutes for last meeting.
So moved. Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Hearing none, motion passes, the minutes are approved. The next item on our agenda is the status of the transaction plan update. And at this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Jasper. Mr. Jasper.
Thank you so much. Good evening. I have a presentation. It's in your packet. I'm going to skim through some highlights and try and leave as much time as possible for feedback from you. The purpose tonight is to get your final feedback on proposed enhancements or amendments to the transaction long-range plan and the associated project list. In the packet, we do have marked under reference slides a summary of the public comments so that you have them for completeness, but it is not my intention to go through those tonight since you've got a bit of an airing of those at your last meeting, but we'll be happy to answer any questions that you have on any of the public comments if that becomes necessary. So the things I do want to focus on are the transaction overview, which is kind of like a refresher, feedback from MBTA and the committees so far, and then the proposed enhancements that we're proposing to make, and then just very quickly on next steps. So the next 5 slides kind of cover a refresher of what transaction is not, some key takeaways and what happens if it is adopted. And part of the reason I want to share this is as a refresher, but also because some of these themes we want to kind of sprinkle through the document, the final draft of the document, kind of help more clearly tell the story of transaction, and also will help us respond to some comments that were received during the comment process. So on the screen here, what transaction is, long-range multimodal plan with that horizon year of 2045 and a list of 429 multimodal candidate projects. As you'll see, the evaluation on those projects collectively was undertaken using the evaluation, using performance measures that this committee and others considered and approved like in the latter half of 2021, ultimately towards the tail end of last year. So that's the way we measure the projects. That is the pathway forward. Those weighted measures were approved by MBTA in November and December of last year. Some jargon that I would be remiss to not go over because we say these terms all the time and assume everyone knows, which is not a good assumption to make at the best of times. So we refer to transaction as being fiscally unconstrained, which means that it intentionally includes more projects than could be reasonably funded by the region. And the reason we do that is because transaction is focusing on transportation needs, and it is not bound by financial considerations. We also use the expression geographically unconstrained, meaning that, again, intentionally, transaction includes projects that extend beyond Northern Virginia, which, if funded, would support the plan's vision and goals. Again, that's because those projects are deemed to help with the travel needs of Northern Virginians, even though they're not in Northern Virginia. Transaction is compliant with the Code of Virginia, which means that by producing this plan, we meet the mandate on MBTA to prepare the plan and maintain the plan. The plan itself is a prerequisite under Virginia Code for selecting candidate projects for funding, and also some legislation from 2012 that is referred to by us, at least, as its original House bill title, HB 599, kind of set forth various performance measure topic areas that we have to adhere to. And again, Transaction does that. So that's what it is. What it isn't, nothing new here. As we mentioned before, it's not a land use plan. That is your prerogative as our member jurisdictions. However, it does incorporate through that process that COG has of developing cooperative planning forecasts, which will start with your forecasts. It does include all the land use assumptions out to 2045. So it certainly takes account of the land use that's expected in the region, but it is not itself a land use plan. We recognize fully the linkage between land use and transportation, and indeed vice versa. To the extent possible, we take account of land use, but we don't actually make Transaction a land use plan. It's not a road building plan, has been asserted from some quarters. It's multimodal. It's not a funding document, and inclusion of any project in Transaction does not commit MBTA to funding said project or projects. That's dealt with in a separate process through our 6-year program. And it's also not a project or modal prioritization or ranking tool, although it does provide information that could be used in that way for project evaluation purposes, but it does not set out to prioritize or rank any individual projects. So the key takeaways that we have for you to kind of keep uppermost in mind is that when adopted, and whatever form it's adopted, it will provide member jurisdictions and regional agencies with a diverse range of multimodal project options for future funding requests through the 6-year program. Subject to project funding, eventually, Transaction does support its vision and goals. Our consultants, represented here by Dahlia Levin, have determined that it does meet, it does address the goals of mobility, accessibility, and resiliency, and it does take account of the core values of equity, sustainability, and safety. The project list is long, and being fiscally unconstrained, it's expensive. And of the different modal components, the largest by a long way is transit at $44.5 billion. Roadway, intersections, interchanges, HOV, HUT, and parking combined, essentially all the road-based projects. Next, and then non-motorized, bike and ped, 1.5 billion, and then technology and TDM, travel demand management, come in at just under $1 billion of projects. One thing Transaction does call out is a regional BRT system, which is in there for a number of reasons. We see a regional BRT system will provide alternatives to driving alone, while still anticipating and planning for metro rail improvements on a much longer timescale. As such, a regional BRT system is also highly supportive of the vision, goals, and the core values. And also, the plan does call out how transportation technologies can be leveraged as the region moves forward. And by that, I'm kind of referring to the fact that the planning integrates some key findings and recommendations from our transportation technology strategic plan. It embraces the potential expansion of projects like the regional multimodal program that NBTA is developing in conjunction with VDOT and DRPT. And it also supports decarbonisation of the transportation system. Continuing on the key takeaways, I want to touch on scenarios. The first two bullets here relate to scenario analysis. As you may recall from your meeting last month, scenario analysis is the name of the approach that we use to kind of try to do some assessment of the uncertainty associated with long-range transportation planning, looking out to a horizon year that's more than 2 decades into the future. Clearly, any forecast is going to be only as good as the assumptions made and the data on which it's based, which become more and more flimsy as you go further and further into the future. So we kind of need to understand what that uncertainty might mean through these scenario analyses. So the first 2 scenarios, the new normal, which really looks at possible post-pandemic world, and technology, which includes aggressive action on electric vehicle infrastructure to help reduce emissions. Both of these scenarios are essentially things that will happen to us. These are not things that we can control. To some extent, we can be proactive in the way we react, in much the way that our transportation technology strategic plan tried to do. It wasn't saying what technology we wanted and we were going to buy or whatever. It was saying, these are the range of things that could happen. How do we want to position ourselves? And that's pretty much where we are with these first 2 scenarios. We're going to be mostly reactive, but we could be proactively reactive. The third scenario, which is called incentives and pricing, is completely different. It's no less challenging to predict or control, except that it will only happen through coordinated actions by multiple layers of government. So in that sense, although it's complex, it is within our grasp to do it, accepting there's a whole range of technical, political, and other reasons, legislative and so on, why it will be hard to do. But if done, it as with the other 2 scenarios, it could be quite impactful. The difference being that we the region could take a mostly proactive posture on the third scenario. So although the scenarios try to do different things, they are different. And if you want to focus on any one of those in particular, the third one will be the one to focus on because there's some degree of control over that going forwards. We have been asked what success might look like from transaction, and it's a very difficult question to answer, not least because of the diversity of the region. It's not a homogeneous region where everything looks the same everywhere. Quite the opposite. Everything from very dense to very rural, and so success will vary from locality to locality. I mentioned again the land use aspect of it. It is a key takeaway that transaction does acknowledge that interrelationship and use COGS, cooperative planning forecast, which is collectively everyone's best look at what land use will be in 2045. And finally, transaction is compliant with the Code of Virginia. And just finally on this section, I'll pause after this slide. If transaction is endorsed by this committee and other committees next month, and adopted by NBTA in December, which is the current schedule we're on, what will happen? As I mentioned earlier, an adopted transaction will provide a range of multimodal transportation options for you and other eligible applicants. You all have your own process for doing that, but if you want to use NBTA's regional revenues, the projects must be in the current version of transaction. Obviously, the current version of transaction was adopted in October 2017, and as soon as this version is adopted, the current one will become invalid, and we'll move to the new one. And that will be important because we're going to do call for projects next calendar year. So that's the kind of the initial funding eligibility that Transaction will provide. As I said earlier, doesn't commit MBTA to funding any of those projects. But in fact, not all of the 429 projects in the draft plan are in Northern Virginia. So for those projects that maybe have 1 foot in Northern Virginia or 1 foot in the District of Maryland, it's possible those projects could be funded using MBTA's regional revenues, but only if there's an acceptable cost sharing arrangement with all neighboring jurisdictions. There is precedent for doing that. So that's not new territory. Obviously, jurisdictions outside of Northern Virginia may not have the same perspective as those in Northern Virginia. So I wouldn't underestimate how difficult it might be to get suitable funding arrangements in place. There also are a small number of projects that are entirely outside Northern Virginia, don't touch Northern Virginia at all. We don't believe there's any legal way MBTA can fund those projects anyway. So finally, if endorsed and adopted, Transaction will provide some initial analytical information to support the evaluation of any candidate projects that are submitted to the next couple of 6-year program update cycles. So that's kind of like my big picture refresher before we get into the weeds. I'm happy to take any questions on that page at this point.
I'm going to start on mine since they're not here to. Board member Karen Tonis, do you have any questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a short one. So I remember a slide that wasn't right now, but I don't have it in front of me. Oh, I do. This is in the packet. It's slide number 20 that shows the performance of Transaction projects by scenario. And it shows built versus no built, and it shows significant decrease in emissions if built under all scenario, different performance. It shows, though, also on the other side, an increase in person trips and in vehicle miles traveled. Remind me, and I'm sure that you mentioned that in past meetings at some point, the per capita VMT. How does this? What's the assessment that a built scenario versus a no built scenario would perform on the per capita VMT base? The reason why I'm asking that is because we have seen in almost all scenario discussions until now, the TPB, for example, that a significant reduction in VMTs, in per capita VMT, is quasi a prerequisite for achieving aggressive or being more ambitious as we go decarbonization goals by 2045 or less. So Arlington, for example, must be performing on reducing per capita VMT and significant increase in electrification of the fleet that is used today in order to achieve our scenario. So how responsive is Transaction to this?
Okay, thank you for the question. I think actually multiple questions in there. The slide 20 that was referred to there, I think, is from the presentation from last month.
Maybe, yes. I just had it in front of me because for me it was an important slide.
Right. So no one in the room, including myself, has got that slide in front of me, but I do recall. I'm going to ask Dahlia Levin to weigh in a moment a little bit on the analysis behind that scenario and how we came up with that. But since there was discussion on that at this committee's last meeting, I think in fact Councilmember Friedrichs raised it at the last meeting, and we also had similar question raised at a number of the other committee meetings. And as such, we've developed a response in tonight's packet to what we were hearing on this topic at the last meeting. So we were happy to go into the detail of what we said last month, although Dahlia wasn't at last month's meeting, but it may also be helpful to kind of hold that until we get to the appropriate point in tonight's presentation, and maybe we can address the bulk of that question at that point. I do want to just say, though, that I touched on this in my opening, that MBTA and transaction has to be compliant with the Code of Virginia. And although COG and TPB have developed optional emissions reduction targets for the region, transaction is not bound by those because it has to be bound by the Code of Virginia. So that's kind of one of the little areas of difficulty we kind of have to deal with, well, not difficulty, but kind of inconsistency we have to deal with there. But if it's okay with the board member and with Madam Chair, then can we revisit that in a few slides down from here?
No question. Sorry for pushing that in advance of when the proper point at the meeting would be.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Councilmember Friedrich, did you have any questions?
My colleague there, I had some questions about our the environmental impact of these projects, and I can wait until it's time to talk about that. So otherwise, this was awesome. Thanks.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay.
Just a quick clarifying, just want your reference to projects partially in NOVA or outside of the region, they're not in the 429 that went into this calculation.
But they are included in 429, yeah.
Okay, so then is there a breakdown somewhere of these impacts of these figures that excludes those out, wholly outside of NOVA or partially outside, since we can't legally fund the ones entirely outside the region, and we are, I would assume, less likely or less frequently fund the partial ones?
Yeah, I'm going to defer to Dahlia just a moment on this, but we by and large, we haven't broken down the long project list into packets of projects. There's some pragmatic considerations in terms of scope, schedule, budget, and so on that precludes us from doing much of that. We have done some, but it's been more modally focused. Essentially, we can't judge whether the likelihood of a project being funded. And so we can't really rationalize to ourselves what we would say, this group of projects are much more likely to get funded than that group of projects. I mean, is not even crystal ball gazing from our point of view. It'd just be total speculation to do that. So we've avoided doing that because we have no rational basis on which to select the projects that will be in which group.
I guess just then some education for me. What I'm not clear on is why projects we cannot fund are included. Like, I appreciate the ones that we can partially fund, but why do we historically include ones that are outside the region?
Right. No. I mean, I get the point of the question. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the key thing here is transportation needs. Some of the more expensive projects in transaction are projects that cross the Potomac.
Sure.
Right. There's a couple of highway projects, which include BRT routes, and then there's the new metro rail option that would connect Virginia to the district and or Maryland. There's no doubt that such a project or all of those projects would affect the way people travel in the region, whether that's people from Maryland and district coming to work and visit in Northern Virginia, or Northern Virginians going the other way. There's a lot of people that do that. And so That's why we included those projects. And I think it really, post adoption of transaction, it really falls on the member jurisdictions to decide, how you want to prioritize funding requests to MBTA. And what we're trying to do is provide a bit of information that will suggest, projects that you might want to take a look at without directing you in any way or prioritizing the projects in any way, because we specifically have been guided not to do that. And it really is your call, not staff call on that sort of thing.
Well, I think that's why I'm asking the question a little bit, because in asking us to endorse or not endorse, like the project, when it's, for me, it's a little tricky when I know that there's things in here that ultimately couldn't be selected potentially. They're included because they're reflective of the needs mandate,
Right.
but that ultimately, so I can't help, and it's my own just curiosity, to what extent are they pulling certain numbers in certain directions? Like, to what extent are they upping that BMT number, or are they upping, or, the emissions number, or reducing it? And so I'm just thinking about that as I'm potentially asked to endorse the plan, like how much is it being tugged in certain directions by things that won't ultimately be funded?
Monica has her hand up, and I want to let her go first, but then I'm.
No, thank you. Thank you for that, Madam Chair. Just to piggyback off of what Keith noted, transaction is a needs-based document. It's not meant to be the funding document. And of course, because we in Virginia, Maryland, and the district are so intricately entwined when it comes to transportation and transportation needs, we know that projects or that are located in Maryland very well have a direct impact on the commuters of those in Virginia. So we want to make sure we are being inclusive. Now, when we get to the 6-year program, that is the funding document. And I know it's oftentimes there's some overlap. And when you ask the question about the cost, I would say, because this is a 20-25-year document that has a 20 to 25-year horizon, even though we update it every 5 years, some of these costs are very rough level planning estimate costs. When these costs become a reality is when they are submitted to us, if they are submitted to us for funding. Now, the us is not only MBTA, it can be smart scale funding. Maryland could look and seek funding for their projects the same as the district. And this is why Keith noted the regional bus rapid transit network that we have encompass in this transaction. I have said this to the authority, so I will say it to you. So the authority isn't surprised. What we would like to do is take the BRT working group information and turn that into a study looking at BRT throughout the region, and the region meaning the COG region, not just Northern Virginia. So I hope that answers some of the questions, but transaction is needs only. And because we are so intricately involved with Maryland and the district, and in some cases, West Virginia, when it comes to Loudoun County and Route 9, we have to include these projects that create some bottlenecks and some commuting issues for Virginia, but may not be located inside of Virginia.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's more context for me and other people that I have to, answer questions to, and just to appreciate. And I get that the needs-based approach of this document is separate from the funding impact cost prioritization that goes into the 6-year plan. So I appreciate the discussion.
So a couple of things that can be done that I don't have the numbers memorized off the top of my head, that's very unlike me, so I apologize, is identifying how much of that cost is related to extraterritorial projects, things that either aren't in Northern Virginia or leave Northern Virginia. That's something we've done in previous meetings, I think, and so that's something that could be called out if we wanted to. The benefits are a little bit harder to quantify. If it helps with context, there are very few, and I can only think of one off the top of my head, project that is wholly outside of Northern Virginia, and that's looking at core capacity improvements for Metro Rail, which are actually required in order to do some of the other things in Virginia that you might want to do with Metro Rail. So there are reasons for doing that, even if NVCA can't properly fund those.
Mhm.
All of the other projects that have sort of 1 foot outside of NOVA are, as Keith mentioned, things like bridges into Maryland, the realignment of the Roslyn station through downtown to Union Station and all the way back around to PG County in some instances, right? These are providing connections to places that Northern Virginians want to go and need to go. And so that's why those are in there.
And then my last just question is about how are needs defined? I appreciate this is all driven by Virginia code and that's the mandate. And so I'm just, if you don't mind, providing me that context, is needs pace of movement, is needs access? Is there a code section you just want to point me to?
Right, yeah. I mean, I mentioned earlier, we had 10 weighted performance measures. So this is how we evaluate the project. So this covers congestion, the ability to travel by non-motorized means, by transit. Some of that does address emissions as one measure, but addresses emissions. In addition to that, we conducted a round of public engagement in the summer of 2021, where a broad cross-section of folks through a variety of means, including an online survey and focus groups, talked to us about how they experience traveling around Northern Virginia. So that kind of flows into the definition of needs as well. And then obviously there's a lot of model-based analysis where we even without any of the 429 projects, we look out to 2045 and see what travel conditions are going to look like, but based on the tools that we have and the growth that's expected. So it's like 23% population growth, 33% growth in jobs, employment in Northern Virginia. It's not to say that the transportation system should be increased by 23 or 33%, but if it's not, then it's not breaking news that travel conditions are going to get worse with that amount of growth. I kind of made the analogies in the past that with your school systems, as you grow, as your jurisdiction population grow, you kind of have to expand the school system. It's a different form of infrastructure, but it's a similar kind of concept. It's not to say you've got to build more, because there are ways of dealing with increased demand that don't involve building more. Notably demand management, which is really where the whole new normal post-pandemic scenario kind of came in, as people actually found ways to accomplish things they do without actually traveling as much or in the same way, in some cases in unpredictable ways, compared to how we saw the world 3 years ago. So that, it's kind of like a multitude of inputs to kind of assess needs. Anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I just refer back to the goals, objectives, and performance metrics, like you measured, right? That those were identified as the things we want to improve.
Yep.
And so to a large extent, those are the places where we looked to find needs and challenges that we could address. Thank you.
And before we proceed, I just want to note that Supervisor Glass has joined us. Are you?
Okay, moving to the
Question.
next. Oh, sorry.
We were talking about the needs-based and the policies that we're trying to define now for the next 25 years, 30, 40 years. Projects that are coming into fruition now, are they looking at any changes in the new normal that have already been projected, planned, and moving forward? I have that, and I don't know if this question is relevant for what we're doing here. And in Percival, there's a 7690 interchange that was planned in 1999 when there were no people living out in that area. So now there's several hundred homes in that area that are butting up against this project.
Right.
And so is there in this policy way to readjust these plans based on the need that time? Or is that for this committee to concern ourselves with for future changes in the environment, since it's a land use problem?
Right. So if there are projects that have been in the works for a long time and they've got funding and they're in project development, maybe under construction, maybe not under construction, but expected to be under construction in the not too distant future, then we treat those sorts of projects, to use jargon, we call it our no build network. If you think about it as a baseline network, that becomes like a given for 2045. This is the system that's going to exist if we do nothing at all. Those new projects that are funded and being built now or about to be built over the next 5 or even 10 years, they're going to be part of our baseline, our no build. And Transaction won't really be looking at those other than comparing conditions against that baseline. So our focus, the 429 projects, these are projects that either do not have funding or they do not have sufficient funding. The majority are from local comprehensive plans, so they've already been through some sort of public process. There are some projects, notably cross-regional projects like technology and the regional BRT system, which don't really appear in those sorts of plans because they've got a foot in so many different jurisdictions. We add those into the plan. They've not previously been through a public process, but they are going through a public process now. So that kind of gives them the legitimacy of having been through some public review and certainly a lot of committee review and ultimately review and approval, hopefully by MBTA. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but there's the baseline, and then there's like the build. It's like but the build is if we built everything, which, as we've already discussed, the region doesn't have the funding capacity to build everything.
Well, this has been funded with coming up to the town for the land use, rezoning it to allow it to be.
But it's tied in with land use because as I say, the bulk of the projects are in the plan because they're in a comprehensive plan, and the comprehensive plan is taking account of land use. So if the planning assumptions that were made, in your locality when those projects were first conceived, if those assumptions are no longer valid, then I guess it's potential the project is no longer valid. But because Transaction is not a land use plan, we take what we're given in terms of comprehensive plan projects. We don't change your plans, and we certainly don't mess with your planning assumptions. We take it at face value as your best view of the future and ours best view of the future. So that's how we deal with it.
Okay, all right, that's all.
Was there anything else?
So my question is, if a project is no longer valid, but there's funds are directed toward that, wouldn't you still have to do that project?
Transaction doesn't change any of that. And when I say projects not being valid, that wasn't a good choice of words. The pattern of travel behavior changes over time, and as such, the needs for projects and the relative importance and priority of projects changes to reflect that over time. So right now we're having a lot of people saying, well, why would you invest more in metro rail extensions and BRE extensions when ridership has tanked? Now, ridership is slowly beginning to come back up. We're not sure what it's going to come back up to relative to early 2020 and prior to that. But that's a change in travel and trip making behavior. COG has recently reported that, obviously a lot more people telecommuting, and those who are traveling appear to be choosing to travel by driving alone more than they were, which is not a good trend. So does that invalidate a rail improvement project? I mean, it depends on the time horizon. It might call into question its need in the next 5 years, but transaction is not looking at the next 5 years. It's looking at a couple of decades. And there's no one who can predict with any reliability at all what trip making behavior is going to be at that point. So we have to, to kind of give it our best view at each 5-year update interval for transaction, and make small adjustments or big adjustments if needed based on what we learn from cycle to cycle. The analogy I like to give is with the National Hurricane Center, but on a different timescale. They would typically produce a hurricane forecast that looks out 5 days. As local meteorological conditions change, they tweak their forecast, and the line of the storm or the intensity of the storm might change. The timing of the storm might change. Well, and they have this thing that kind of starts with a point where the system is at the moment, and it kind of becomes a bit of a cone. What I like to call the cone of uncertainty. We're dealing with a cone of uncertainty as well, where we know exactly what conditions are like today, but tomorrow, next week, next month, next year, and certainly next decade and 2 decades, the uncertainty continues to build. So where we actually land at that time is anyone's guess. We just try to use the past and what we understand of the future together with those scenarios to get our best grip that we can on uncertainty.
Thank you.
We can go ahead.
Okay. So I just wanted to quickly recap what we heard from the committees, including this committee, in the September meeting cycle. So that cycle kicked off with the Technical Advisory Committee. And to be fair to the committee, which met on September 21st, the public comment period ended on September the 18th. So we had very little time to do much more than high-level view of the public comments at that stage. And so they did not get the benefit that this and other committees got of that analysis. And so that probably affected their comments to some extent, but they asked whether the biped comments that we've received were generally favorable, which they generally were. Does transaction contribute to an increase in electric vehicle adoption, which I think is the earlier questioning has been on this topic. We'll come back to that. And on a similar note, can you isolate the benefits of EV adoption? Specific point about maps, including units. And again, returning to emissions reduction, there's a question about how we did the analysis. In terms of what we compared with what, to kind of understand what impact that had on the numbers that we were producing. So that was quite a topic of interest back in mid-September. And then this committee covered a number of things. Councilmember Malam raised a question about projects in Western Loudoun County and how that affects environmental impacts and so on, whether that would be just in the plan. Generally, transaction does not get into the details of individual projects. That in a long-range plan that's looking at a very high level, that's more appropriate to be dealt with as part of project development as that is ongoing. Again, this committee focused on the 54% reduction in emissions that was referenced in the document. We'll come back to that. A question about whether weather events are considered, which they're not. And some focus on the scenarios. And in particular, I think the Supervisor Alcorn was saying, those scenarios are having big impacts. Why would we spend 75 billion on these projects? And the answer to that question is basically, you don't control the scenarios. Just because the scenarios are having an impact that you like, It doesn't mean it's going to happen because the scenarios are a view of the future, but they are not a prediction of the future. The Planning and Programming Committee met on October 3rd, although this is the September cycle, they actually met in October. And so they had to have more time to think about it again. As such, there were more questions, I think. So you can see, I won't go through all of these here, but some of this is kind of more kind of advice and guidance as to how we communicate within the document as much as it was about the content of the document. But again, I think the question of electric vehicles came up and the impact on emissions reduction. And then some specific questions that kind of related to, you know, not good communication on our part about the definition of build and no build and what's in each of those. So that's something we're giving consideration to. And then finally, MBTA met on October 13th. We didn't really plan to have discussion in detail about transaction. We actually, I think, planned to talk to them about, you know, present the findings of the public comment period, which had ended just a month earlier. But in that discussion, we did also touch on some general areas of enhancement and change we had already identified through the draft document. And so one of the first questions that came up again was the 54% reduction related to electric vehicles. And then there's some other suggested approaches to dealing with communicating results, making sure we acknowledge negative comments were some. There were a number of negative comments that were related to one particular project in Prince William County, discussion on the environmental goals, and so on. Again, the region's diversity and how that gets reflected in the plan. And a couple of members said, hey, you know, at the end of the day, it's a long-range plan. We can't solve everything in the long-range plan for one jurisdiction. And so there's this kind of sense of trying to perhaps keep a bit of, you know, proportion or whatever as to how we think about transaction and its role. So that's just a very quick recap on what we heard from the committees. Obviously, I mentioned earlier, all the public comment summary is provided as reference slides. So all of that is what we're taking together as we work towards coming up with a final draft of the document and the project list, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about. Again, I'm happy to take a pause here if there's any comments on comments that I just recapped. And we will get into that 54% electric vehicle emissions reduction in the next section.
Again, just for a little historical context for me, the public comments, were they in line with the general tenor and, you know, of the past comments? Is there an increasing, you know, amount of comments favoring certain modes over others, or opposing certain projects over others? Do you see any trends in the comments?
Yes. And then there's some things like, if you step back, you could say, well, kind of not there. One of the first questions I asked my team when they were analysing these comments and the consultants was, because it was a different consultant last time, so they actually wouldn't know the answer to this question. My colleague sitting over behind me there was able to very quickly tune into the fact that for this update cycle, we got about 200 and I'm just looking for the number, 223 comments, which were from 201 individual. Some people were commented through multiple channels or on multiple projects. And that's fine. That happens all the time. The corresponding number from 5 years ago when we last did this was more than 3 times that number. So the big takeaway I took was, well, not the takeaway, the head scratcher really is, why did we only get 1/3 of the comments this time when, trust me, we did a whole lot more to promote this plan for public engagement. this time compared to 5 years ago. Not that we kind of, just didn't try hard last time. We tried hard last time, but we went to the extra mile and then the extra mile beyond that. We did it in 3 languages. We did pop-up events in places where people, were likely to be frequenting who wouldn't not normally engage through traditional processes for this sort of document. There were some conclusions we drew from this. We did do the public comment partly over the summer. There have been other transportation comment periods over the same general timeframe. People may be thinking, I've already commented on that, not knowing it was a different thing. And so they didn't comment on us because they thought we already had when they're actually commenting on something else. It could be, as some authority members said, maybe the people are happy and they don't have any comments, which is plausible. I mean, we don't know because we've not really gone out to get that kind of feedback. But I mean, it's certainly possible that there may just not have been sufficient interest despite our best efforts. So that was the first key takeaway I had, was the level of commenting was quite low. There definitely were some signs of organized commenting, which again is quite normal and quite acceptable. But it does, in this case, perhaps account for a higher proportion of the comments than would have been the case had we got 600 or 700 comments rather than 220 odd comments. So I won't say that's skewing it in any way, but we did have, for example, about 24 people commenting negatively on one of the 429 projects in Prince William County. That clearly was a coordinated response, and that alone accounted for about 10% of the comments that people see just on a single project on the project list, which again, as I said earlier, Transaction does not commit funding, and I think a lot of people are saying don't fund this project. Well, Transaction would never have funded that project anyway, because that's not the function of Transaction to fund projects. It's to create eligibility for funding projects, but not to fund projects. So there was, generally, a move against roadway projects and supportive of transit projects. There were some comments on the scenario analysis. We structured an online comment form to help people navigate through the areas that we thought would be most helpful for them and us, kind of hear how they were feeling, while leaving open the availability to comment on anything they wanted to, but to try and get some common feelings going through it. So I'd say that there was probably more negative than positive, and that was focused more on roadway than other modes.
Useful, thank you.
And I just see Councilmember Friedrichs has a question.
Yeah, so back to the environmental impact questions. Most of us received, or probably all of us received, an email from a gentleman named Bill Pugh, who is representing Coalition for Smarter Growth, regarding how we can amend Transaction to address questions having to do with the climate crisis. And I'm not positive that I understand what our role is in this effort. Are we able to in any way break down the emissions targets in the larger area to our part and figure out a way to measure the projects that we're working on? I mean, you said that NVTA's overseers decided to remove the 54% reduction in emissions aspect from the paper, from the presentation. And I'm wondering, number one, where the 54% came from. Number two, is there no way we can use it if it's a real number? And number three, how do we figure out what our true emissions goals are? And even number 4, does the code allow us to take any of that into account, or does it forbid us from taking something into account? It's a lot of questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'll try and address these apart from the one on the 54%, because Dahlia will be able to handle that one far more eloquently than I. But let me just kind of go back to this time last year. We were asking you to endorse performance measures and weights associated with those performance measures, specifically for the use of those measures in the evaluation of transaction. Okay, and so we settled on 10 measures, and then you went through a voting process to decide, given 100 points, how you distribute those 100 points over the 10 performance measures. So an average of 10 points per measure actually was pretty close to the final outcome, which was 8 measures had 10 points, 1 measure had 5 points, and 1 measure had 15 points. Across the board, now that 10 measures is a lot. When you have that many measures, it begins to dilute the impact of what you're trying to achieve, if your focus is on one of those measures. As Ms. Batman pointed out at the time, we had the attorneys in the room for several of those committee meetings, because if the measures were steering too much in one direction and was not addressing congestion, then there was a concern that we would be violating our state mandates, which relate back to 2002 when this authority was created, and 2014 when it got a funding stream. So there was concern that we can't kind of do a dramatic turn to the left or the right or in reverse when the Code of Virginia has kind of laid out the general way in which we go forward. Although it did give us flexibility in how we go forward, and I think that flexibility was used a year ago when those performance measures were voted upon and the weights voted upon. So that's kind of really the genesis of the analysis that we did. Now, with respect to the 54%, the 54% is a good number. The key here is we maybe didn't do a great job in explaining what the 54% was. The number was not wrong, and we're not proposing to remove it because it was wrong. We're proposing to remove that number from the final. We haven't got to this section yet. We're proposing to remove a bar on a chart that refers to a 54% reduction in emissions, because there's some confusion as to what it actually means. And we don't want to confuse anyone, so we want to step back and put that straight. But there's actually a bigger picture in here. The 54% is associated with one of the 3 scenarios. No, okay, I'm back off there. I'm going to hand over to Dahlia to kind of give us an understanding of where the 54% comes from, and then I'll pick up on Councilmember Fridge's other points after that.
Okay, so transaction includes 3 region-wide projects related to electrifying vehicles. One is focused on electrifying transit vehicles, so primarily buses. One is focused on electrifying heavy-duty trucks, and one is focused on electrifying sort of the light-duty vehicles, so cars. These were put into the project list specifically so that in the future, MBTA could fund projects related to electrifying vehicles, because if they're not in the project list, MBTA could never fund them. The question is, how do we evaluate the impacts of those 3 projects? And so the 54% comes from the notion of, if we electrify our vehicle fleet to in each of those 3 areas to what seems possible, right? So each of the assumptions that we used was based on forecasts both within the state and at a national level of what electrification in those 3 market segments would look like. there would be large portions of the vehicle fleet, 100% of buses, that's a goal for a lot of our transit providers. I think it was 8.4% of heavy trucks, they're harder to electrify, they're carrying a lot of weight. And about 77%, I think, was the number of light duty vehicles could be electrified if we made a concerted effort to do that. And so, built off of those assumptions, we said if that electrification takes place because of electrification projects that NVTA is able to fund, then that results in a 54% decrease in tailpipe emissions.
That's great. Thanks.
That is where that number comes from.
That's much
I
better.
think there is a tiny bit of confusion over the notion that electrification could occur from projects that NVTA is not funding. So it could happen anyway. And I think that's where some of the confusion from whatever email you may have gotten is that maybe these projects are taking credit for too much. I think that's some of the confusion we've gotten into, and I think part of the reason that we've decided to take it out, because we don't want to be claiming all of the credit in the world for electrification.
I think that the email I got asked that it basically said transaction must be upfront on the climate crisis and the action needed to reduce the region's largest source of emissions, and then it lists all of the things that we need to be more upfront about. And I'm sorry if you all didn't get this email. I only got it maybe an hour and a half ago, or 2 hours ago. So I didn't really have time to absorb all the information, but I think that, board member Karatonis was referring to it as well when we were talking. Is that right, Takis?
Yes, I was motivated by that, especially on the VMT part, that I'm struggling because there's one thing that, overall we have an increase of VMT. There's also a population aspect to all of this, and different stories to discuss whether per capita VMT is decreasing or not. So, yeah.
And that was why my question was focused on what our mandate really is, and if there's any wiggle room in how we present, not only present, but design. And obviously, we're not designing the future roads and road projects. They're being presented to us, but is there a mechanism by which we can either help or what's the word, or encourage movement in the desired direction?
I'm happy to respond to that. If Councilmember Friedrichs, if you are inclined to do so, I'd be happy to receive that email from you, just so I could understand what you're being asked to ask us, and that may help with our response in due course. But I think really I just come back to what I've said earlier. Transaction as a needs-based document. We're trying to address within transaction, what the region will look like if we do nothing, what the region could look like if we implement, projects that we've been quite clear in stating cannot be afforded. And it really becomes for the region to decide, where the wiggle room is to go forward through funding mechanisms, as opposed to this transaction plan, I would say. So, the jurisdictions will need to decide either individually or collectively or in small groups, just what sort of projects that they think the region should be pursuing funding for. But that is not the role of transaction, and so I think it. I mean,
Keith, can I chime in here,
Yes.
please?
Thanks.
Um, So
Save us.
thank you for the question, and if you could share the email, because we didn't get it, that would be appreciated. I think one of the things that need to be stated, and we say this often, that one of the reasons why the authority funds multiple modes is because there is no one-size-fit-all solution when you look at the performance measures, the goals, the core values, and the mission that we're trying to accomplish, given the diversity of this region. Some parts of the region may very well feel that one or two of the performance measures are more important than other performance measures, and we understand that, but it's our job to look at the system as a whole, the entire network, and not pull out individual measures. We do have the weighting, but we're trying to look at the performance of the entire network with these 10 performance measures, with the goals, the core values, the vision statement in accord with the law. And again, I totally understand where you are in the region probably really dictates which modes you feel that your area, your jurisdiction needs most. But we're serving a diverse region, economically diverse, geographically diverse. There's a lot of diversity in this region. And we're trying to make sure that everyone has equal access to all modes, because there is no one-size-fit-all solution when we look at the commuting needs and trying to get around in this region. One of the things the authority members always say, they care about climate change. We all care about climate change. We want to make sure that people can get to work as well. We want to make sure the facility is safe. There are a lot of things that we're trying to undertake in doing the long-range transportation plan, which of course isn't the funding document, but I think because it is the gateway, and we will be honest about that, to receiving MBTA funds, because the law says in order to receive regional revenues, you must be in the long-range transportation plan. So we understand that as well. But my whole point in chiming in regarding the multiple modes, the 10 performance measures, the core values, the goals, the vision statement, we're trying to marry all of this to make sure at the end of the day that everyone has access to all of these modes, that we're trying to serve a very diverse region.
Got it. Thank you. That was incredibly helpful. I appreciate it.
Okay.
54% for three,
The projects,
no, the three
the assumptions behind them.
assumptions. Electrification
Of trucks,
truck,
buses,
buses, the number one. Electrification of buses,
trucks, and what we call light duty vehicles, but are essentially for intents and purposes, cars.
okay, that's it, I think.
Okay, do you want to go to the next slide?
Can I answer one other question about
Actually,
the
if we could table that until we get through.
Sure.
the rest of the thing.
So on slide 15, get into a bit more detail about what we're proposing to do. And the first one, page 17 of the draft plan, not the packet, but I think the draft plan was linked in meeting invite, but you can toggle to the draft plan. If you could do that, Haroon, I'll go to page 17. And you can see the bar in a chart that's the source of concern. We want to address this. I mean, I think we've heard loud and clear that it's causing confusion, and we need to fix that confusion, particularly as in some ways it's detrimental to the whole transaction effort, because it, as Dahlia said, it depends upon what assumptions you want to make about what will happen in the region in terms of the take-up of electric vehicles, which we can make our best guesses at and calculate impacts based on best guesses. But again, we're not controlling what actually happens within the region. MBTA has very little control over that. So the slide in question, the page in question is this one, and it may not be possible, but there, yes, Haroon's pointing to it, there's a bar there that says minus 54% for measure F1. Just below that, there's a plus 1.7% emissions reduction also for F1, where the current EV rates have been assumed. So depending on what assumption you make, we're showing anything between 54% reduction to a 1.7% increase. We've tried to be clear, but we've failed, obviously, because we're getting a lot of comments on this. I think a lot of focus on the 54% reduction, but we've tried to make clear here, and we'll work harder on this in the next draft and in the blue box that you see in the bottom right-hand corner there, to explain why you might get minus 54% and why you might get plus 1.7%. And in reality, you're probably going to get something in between. We just don't know what that will be. So we tried to be as clear as we could by stating a range in this. But obviously, that has caused unintended consequences in terms of interpretation of what we're trying to do and potentially taking credit for something that we can't take credit for. So we want to clean that up. So that's the first thing. That's relates to page 15 of the meeting packet tonight. And go back to the presentation now. On section 7, which is where we address scenario analysis. Scenario analysis is one of those things that people like Dahlia and I absolutely love, because it really gets us into numbers and data and analysis. But we have to curb our enthusiasm, because the report is not being written for our benefit, it's being written for your benefit and citizens' benefit. And so, we're kind of coming to the conclusion when it comes to scenario analysis, as robust as the analysis is, we need to think about how we present it. And so that's one of the bigger areas that we're kind of working on at the moment. So we could potentially take the scenario analysis in section 7 and roll it into section 6, which is where we talk about the overall results from transaction, and make it more of a footnote on the results as opposed to a big thing in its own right. Or we could keep section 7 as is and focus less on the black box that generates the numbers and the analysis, and more on what we learned from it, which would require our readers, yourselves included, to kind of trust us that the analysis is robust. And if you do, then focus on the discussion of what the scenario analysis is actually telling us. So that's one way, one big area that we're working on right now, to try and clarify and communicate better on what scenario analysis is and what we learned from it. And the important thing to remember is those scenarios are considered to be plausible, but they're not predicted, and they're certainly not preferences. But we feel as though they're a good way to build that cone of uncertainty I mentioned earlier. Another aspect about the scenarios is, remember I said 2 of those scenarios are things that will happen to us, and one of them is something that we the region could make happen. So they're different in that regard, and we don't want the kind of discussion to be detrimental to an understanding of what the region could do by focusing too much on what it can't control. So that's another area of emphasis we're looking to maybe shift, so we can better understand what the incentives in pricing scenario is telling us, and what the region might want to think about. Again, transaction will not tell you how to go about doing incentives and pricing as kind of like an implementation project. That again is way too detailed for a transaction. But if there's interest in understanding how incentives and pricing could work together in much the same way we see them doing today on I-66 inside the Beltway at peak times in the peak direction, in much the same way you see on the express lanes with variable pricing, where you have a choice between a reliable journey at a cost versus perhaps a less reliable journey for free. These are some of the basic concepts of incentives and pricing, together with one of the technology projects we're working on with VDOT and DRPT, which again is looking at how incentives may change travel behavior to help manage the system better, to get more out of the system, and at the same time, still give people safe, reliable, equitable transportation. That's an area where I personally feel quite passionate about, but at the moment, I think that that message is getting completely overwhelmed by the other scenarios. We have thought about adding in some land use scenario analysis. We haven't actually done any in this cycle, but we did do it 5 years ago. We believe the results from 5 years ago are mostly still sound, because not much has changed that would cause the analysis that we did 5 years ago to be very different. And so there's value in putting it in, but on the other hand, does it just add more noise to kind of like squash the messaging that we really want to come through this document? So I don't know, I'm not particularly enthusiastic about including it, but you know, open to hearing your thoughts on that. In section 8 of the document, which is the part that talks about regional benefits, getting very close to the end of the document now. Obviously, if we take out section 7, and this will get renumbered to section 7. But the main thing is to emphasize those takeaways, those overview slides that I mentioned earlier in this presentation, to answer the question, so what? You know, what is transaction actually telling us? Is it clear what transaction is and what it is not? And what are the limitations and what external factors might happen that could cause any of this to change? And again, we've had the question raised to us several times. It's a challenging one to answer, but what would success look like in the region from transaction? We'll give that a shot. And there's some general points. I think this is mostly just to wrap up now. I've got the project to talk about. Does it communicate as well as it could? Need to emphasize what it is and what it isn't. Can ignore this third bullet about carbon pollution as an alternate term for emissions or greenhouse gas. This is a term that federal government has just started using. We think it's tied to the way they want to treat carbon pollution under the auspices of EPA legislation. That's not a reason for us to change. We thought about it to be consistent with federal government, but on balance, we don't understand sufficiently well what carbon pollution means and how it might be different to emissions or greenhouse gas, which are things that the region has got a long history of using, and we just want to stay consistent with that going forward. Maybe 5 years we'll use carbon pollution, but I'm not sure we want to do that now. The subject of COG's environmental goals has come up. And I guess just to re-emphasize, we have to recognize that COG and MBTA are working under different legislative frameworks. COG is, or at least the TPB, is a metropolitan planning organization that is federally designated. So they're working under a set of federal rules. MBTA was created by the General Assembly of Virginia, and there are a number of pieces of legislation that are applied to MBTA, which represent the highest kind of legislative compliance that we must conform to. So there's different legislative frameworks between us and COG. You have to understand and recognize that. MBTA did go through that process I mentioned a year ago of coming up with weighted measures. COG in setting its 50% reduction in emissions relative to 2005 by 2030, and correspondingly 80% reduction by 2050. These are goals. I understand they've been referred to by COG as optional goals. They're not legally mandated. And while there are general strategic themes to accomplish these reductions, there's no detailed action plan that MBTA could even attempt to emulate. These goals were, if I remember correctly, for transportation were set in June of this year. We set our performance measures in December of last year. I can't remember 3 weeks is talking about can we make any tweaks to the process. I think the answer really is the transaction process. No, it's too late. And if we were to change it, what would we change it to, and what would be the rationale for changing it? We just don't know we don't know in detail what TPB and COG are going to do when it comes to achieving those goals. So it's very hard for us to say that we should follow the lead when the lead isn't established yet, other than in that optional goal. So it kind of, how we deal with that, how we word that, I don't know, but it's come up enough that we might need to address that. A couple of final things, beautification. I don't want to sound cosmetic or putting appearance ahead of content, but I do think we can make it a little bit prettier. So we're trying to do that, and anywhere where there's jargon that hasn't been brought to our attention that's still in here, we'll try and address that in some way. I apologize, we do kind of fall into that habit of using terms that we assume everyone understands when there's no rationale for that assumption to be made. That's the plan document. That's this thing, and then we have. I hold this up as if you've got it. You haven't actually got it. You've got a link to it, and then likewise the project list, which is a longer document. We're not proposing to remove any projects from the project list, other than there are 3 pairs of projects which have been identified as duplicates. Essentially, they were given unique ID numbers because the projects sounded slightly different. But when we actually kind of went through our own final checks, we realized that they were either the same project or they were so similar that we could combine them with a very minor change of scope or in the description of the project. So these are the ones that are listed here. We have worked with the jurisdictions involved with these projects to make sure that everyone's on board with what we're proposing to do, and that there are no additional model runs expected or needed because these changes are so minor. On the next slide, similar kind of theme, probably less consequential. The first 2 main bullets also do not necessitate any model runs. The first one is changing the project sponsor for a couple of projects. The second one is changing the project location. It doesn't affect any of the analysis, but we just need to do some tidy up. The third one here, this is one of those areas where discussion with Councilmember Milan earlier about projects being in the no build or the baseline versus being in the build or part of the 429 project list. There are a couple of projects that started off in the project list, which during the course of the transaction work kind of moved from being unfunded no builds to being funded, and in one case constructed or under construction projects. So those projects need to be moved out of the project list into the baseline, essentially removed from the project list. They are no longer eligible for funding because they don't need any funding. They're being built. The consultant did do a little bit of modeling just to check to make sure that, of course, no change to any of the findings. There are some small tweaks in some numbers which we will incorporate, but nothing that affects anything substantive in the document. And then finally, in terms of enhancements, the interactive map is not actually a part of transaction. It's a tool to help people understand transaction. It's a wonderful tool. I wish we could have done this 5 years ago. It basically enables you to kind of click on a project on a map and understand about it without having to wade through like a 40-page document to find the project. If you have access to the map, it's on our website, just go to it, click it, all the details pop up. It's wonderful. There's also a table on our website which helps you analyze projects in various ways. It's also a wonderful tool which we had 5 years ago. With respect to the map, we found one project where the western terminus was incorrectly defined by a small distance. We correct that as well. And anything else we find subsequently. This tool is so helpful. We want to keep it online, even when transactions adopted, obviously updated to reflect the changes I mentioned. I have one last slide, which is basically 3 bullets. 3 in the past, 3 are in the future. The first one, fall 2022, is really where we are now, which is finalizing the draft plan project list based on public comments and your feedback. Slide 23. Next month, we'll be come back to you, final draft, and request your endorsement. We will send the draft to you a week ahead of the meeting, which is scheduled for November 16th, and it'll be a virtual meeting. And then, subject to what happens that night, we hope to go to the authority meeting in December and request that they adopt the final version of transaction.
Were there any questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned about the land use portion, maybe not. I think that would be a good idea to include that, because I say that because every jurisdiction has a comp plan,
Yes.
and that covers land use
Yes.
in that comp plan. We're facing that in Percival with the 697 interchange, because that project wants to clear about 14 acres of trees. And we have in our comp plan that we want to maintain a tree canopy in our area. And the community parking lot wants to pave over 10 acres of meadowland where the farmers need those meadows for pollination for the farms in the area. So land use should be considered as part of the mix when determining what projects may be advanced out as the community and the Loudoun County grows, because we are experiencing some growth in housing development and encroachment on our boundaries for projects that the county is implementing in areas where there were farms or meadows that will be destroyed once these major transportation projects go into effect. It's going to disrupt the wildlife there. There are critters in the ground. When they get disrupted, then the field mice will come to your house. So, those things have to be considered, and that's where we're going through with the county now, is trying to figure out how.
If I may, I want to be clear on when I say land use, what we'll actually be doing. We're at a much higher level now. We're not project specific in what we'll be doing, but what we did last time is, there's that delta I mentioned, a growth of 23% in population, 33% in jobs. Your jurisdictions, for the most part, do a great job of putting that growth in the places where you want the growth to happen, which for the most part is in the areas where there's already a lot of densification going on. What we did was to take what Spatman referred to as a bookend approach. Instead of that growth occurring the way your comp plans assume or want it to happen, it will happen in one of 2 different ways. One would be that not just most of the growth will be in those activity centers, but all of the growth will be in those activities. So there'll be nothing going anywhere other than where it's already the most dense. Then the other bookend was to take that growth and say, no, none of it or most of it, it's going to go to low dense places where you probably don't want it to go, but it's the other extreme, maybe you might say the worst case scenario. I won't editorialize on that. It's to simply say, instead of it going where you have it now, it'll become more dense or it'll become a lot less dense. Only the growth, what's already there will stay where it's at. It's the growth that will be distributed differently. We found some interesting things. It was not necessarily intuitive what we found. I don't think at the end of the day, it made a huge difference to anything in the plan. But I mean, out of completeness, where we summarized the scenarios that we did do this time, we could maybe as a footnote add something along those lines about what we did last time. So there's just more data in there for you to chew over when you think about whether you want to endorse this plan.
Likewise, following on to that. So what I just heard you say, tell me if I'm wrong. Our friends at the Coalition for Smarter Growth might advocate for that development model that you mentioned as one of the bookends. Like regional activity centers are where all the rest going to happen. And all transportation policies need to feed into that. That would tend to underplay the construction of new highways, tend to emphasize investments in transit and cycling and walking and so forth. In the presentation of this document that we're working on here, is that a scenario that you can give more exposure to? And then what I just heard you say was, in spite of that, if you took that approach, you would still end up with significant congestion and emissions problems and so forth. Just trying to find a way to, at least for jurisdictions like mine inside the Beltline, to have a story to tell that indicates that we've looked at an alternative future that would be much less reliant on roadway construction and more focused on other modes. And yet, 25, 40 years out, that's not going to be enough to deal with some of the issues that we're concerned with.
Yeah. I think in the case of your city, City of Falls Church, the more dense scenario wouldn't have looked a whole lot different to what is likely already in your plan, because I think, if I recall correctly, about 100% of the growth in your jurisdiction is going to go to the most dense place already. So, one of our bookends would actually coincide with what is already baked in, as it were. I'm not sure where the other bookend would be.
The City of Falls Church is a unique entity in that the entirety of the city is an activity center. So it doesn't change much necessarily in the City of Falls Church.
So what you're saying is that's not the case for jurisdictions larger than.
Correct. Portions of
Where we are actually, I know we're small, but we do have in our heads, regional, local activity centers that we're trying to densify, and we're trying not to touch, a lot of other areas.
Yes.
And so I'm trying to carry that approach out to Loudoun County. Like, what happens if you develop Loudoun County over the next 40 years in a way that basically created, I don't know, pick a number, 4 or 5, 6 major regional activity centers, and everything else pretty well stayed the way it is now. No more density.
And what we did find when we did this last time around is that a large portion of the growth is already planned for those sort of regional activity centers. And so there is some more that can be done. Certainly there's not no growth in non-activity centers planned. And so they can be a little bit more concentrated, but that's already the plan for most of the region, right? Most of the jurisdictions have already made that smart decision for that smart land use. So we did do that analysis, and as Keith mentioned, right, it does result in more transit trips. It does result in folks staying more concentrated, but because we have a large region and people travel around it, doesn't magically cure congestion.
When you say activity center, can you explain that to me? I'm sure what that.
Do you wanna-
It's a-
Well, the regional activity centres are designated by COG, and that they essentially represent areas of, you know, dense activity, be that employment, residence, other commercial or just generally other activities, hospitals, whatever. Now, one of the things that, I mean, like Stalia said, City Falls Church is one giant regional activity centre in the entire city. Tyson's is 4 activity centres that are cool. One of the problems we find in Loudoun and Prince William County is COG hasn't designated so many regional activity centres. And in Western Loudoun, I'm not even sure, probably Leesburg is the nearest activity centre.
And next will be Winchester, we're in the middle.
And right, yeah. So yeah, probably the bigger impacts of this type of analysis will be more in those outer jurisdictions than in the central or inner jurisdictions. I can't recall where it left Fairfax, and there were some weird things happening where the densification got so great that it actually reduced transit ridership, I think.
It increased congestion.
Increased-
Because you're putting everybody in a
Right.
very small area. We did see
Yeah,
growth in transit trips, but you're actually seeing increases in congestion in either version of the land use.
right, for different
One,
reasons.
because people are taking very long trips, and one, because everybody's very concentrated, so you've got some very bad Manhattan-style congestion in some of those areas. So that is one of those things that we had seen. But Fairfax County is a great example, right? When we did this the last time 5 years ago, they had recently redone a lot of their land use planning to put all of their growth
Right.
in the activity centers.
And I think you mentioned advocacy groups, like in one of those bookends over the other one. That's understandable. We're not advocating for either, but I think the bigger takeaway is the region's doing a phenomenal job in densification already. How much more you can gain in the region, I think our analysis showed not a whole lot. Right?
And
That's the real rub, I think. I mean, Coalition for Smarter Growth, not to focus just on them, but, they want you to develop space between, Leesburg and Winchester in a different way than we all have been thinking. They don't want sprawling subdivisions of single-family homes. They want a different, denser, node of activity. What is that regional activity center? Yeah, it's residential, commercial, educational, medical. All those needs can be met by walking.
Right.
Basically by walking. That's what we're trying to build in Falls Church, West Falls
That's
Church,
what we're trying to.
hooked into transit. So what are we talking about here out of all of this that would vision that and project that? And I can say it's beyond the scope because it is not the way we've done it in the past necessarily.
what we found when we did this 5 years ago is it is the way most of the land use plans in the region are currently set
Yeah, the
up,
current land use plan.
right? For moving forward.
The people most concerned about climate change seem to want to rethink the whole way that we have planned the way we live and get around. And it's a very fundamental, and it's, Falls Church has manifested itself in cycling and walking, especially cycling. Those are the most active. I don't know, in your other jurisdictions, the pressures, interest groups are different. Most people are probably just frustrated with sitting at traffic lights for too long and they want more lanes.
Yeah.
And you have to have.
Get more lanes, you get more congestion.
Exactly. The more people use we have people complaining about the fact that we are encouraging electric vehicles because they're still single occupancy vehicles that are a threat to cyclists. Okay, well, I'm having a hard time keeping up here.
Yeah.
But I don't know, it's just, I read all these other articles, listen to Monica, and, I'm trying preach the religion. But I don't think we can just stick our head in the ground and not acknowledge that what we're engaged in here is a view of the world that some interest groups at least view quite differently.
Were there any other questions? Okay, well, if there are no more questions, we're going to turn it over to Ms. Backman for an MBTA update. Ms. Backman, for sure. So,
She's still on the call.
I put her to sleep.
Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, no, you did not put me to sleep. I totally got and agree with everything you said. The only thing I have to add at this particular point is that the authority is working on its 2023 legislative program. We will have the first read in front of the full authority at the November authority meeting, and we anticipate adopting the legislative program at our December meeting. Just as a reminder, it will probably look very similar to the 2022 legislative program, with the priority of protecting the regional revenues, and not only the revenues of the authority, but the revenues that our sister agencies also receive. It's critically important that we protect those revenues and the restoration of the remaining 38.5 million from the diversion of revenues to Metro that happened in 2018. So we are working on that legislative program. We are asking for the localities to try to incorporate some of that language into the legislative program. If you have questions, or if your locality is adopting before us, I can send you the draft that we shared with the authority and the Governance and Personnel Committee at the October meeting. And that's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Okay, does anyone have any final questions or comments? Yes.
So tonight was really just meant as a briefing and a preview of what the plan will look like in 3 weeks or so, which you'll email to us in advance. And then next month's meeting will actually be an action item to endorse, not endorse. Will there be any opportunity to comment and propose any edits in that window of time between whatever the final version? I mean, essentially what we saw tonight, is that the final version?
Well, we haven't prepared the final version. You've received previously there's only one version so far, which is the public comment version, which I think you provided links to in the invite for this meeting. So that's still on our website, even though public comments closed. So you've already got access to that if you want to comment on that. What we've outlined tonight is the changes we think we're going to make. We've also had some good feedback tonight, so that might.
That's a little bit. I was curious about. Would any of tonight's discussion be reflected potentially in that document that we're going to get in a few weeks?
Potentially, yeah. He's got good notes.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, like I said, we will get it to you a week before your meeting. More than that if we can, but not less than that.
Could I ask the Madam Chair, the next meeting is supposed to be virtual and off the usual schedule?
Yes.
If you have a quorum issue, I might have a hard time making that meeting, even though it's virtual. I'm 98-year-old dad. But I would try to call in if I'm needed for quorum.
Okay.
In advance by a couple of days or so, maybe.
Yeah, so Howard normally sends out an email to do a forum call. So if we're in trouble with that plan, I'm sure we will follow up.
Okay.
And you get. Ready, any other questions or comments? Okay, if there's nothing else, I will take a motion to adjourn.
So move.
Second.
All right. All those in favor?
All right.
See you in November.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Wherever you are.
I should have said my apologies. I'm in Virginia Beach at the Governor's Transportation Conference, so my apologies.